My dad filed for divorce the morning after my cancer surgery, and my sister demanded I take Mom in. I smelled a rat. I didn't just hang up. I hired an investigator. I uncovered 3 years of systematic theft, proving my own sister was the one draining my parents' life savings. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who's listening. My name is Andrea Hirsch, 41 years old, and my life feels like a house of cards, currently being battered by a Category 5 hurricane. Yesterday, I was lying in a cold hospital bed, my body still numb from the radical mastectomy that was supposed to save my life. I was supposed to be resting, healing, and processing the new reality of my body. Instead, the morning sun had barely touched the sterile linoleum of my room before the phone began to ring incessantly. It was my sister, her voice sharp with the kind of performative panic that usually preceded her demanding favors. She told me Dad had just served Mom with divorce papers, completely out of the blue, and that the house was in absolute chaos. She barely asked how my surgery went. She only cared that Mom was now technically homeless and needed a place to stay immediately. She told me that Mom had been through enough and it was my turn to step up as the eldest daughter. I felt the stitches across my chest pull tight as I listened to her lecture me about familial duty. I felt a cold, sharp anger override the physical pain. I hung up the phone without saying a single word. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone again, but this time I did not call family. I dialed the number for Mom's old estate attorney, a man who had known our secrets for decades. I needed to know why this was happening now, while I was at my most vulnerable point. I needed to find the truth behind the sudden fracture of my family, and I had a sinking feeling that the divorce was merely a distraction from something far more sinister, hiding beneath the surface of our wealth. The air in the room felt thin, and as I waited for him to pick up, I stared at the blank hospital wall, wondering if I was about to lose everything I had ever known. The attorney, Mr. Henderson, answered on the second ring, his voice sounding older and more weary than I remembered from my childhood. I skipped the pleasantries, my voice raspy from the anesthesia, and demanded to know the current state of my parents' financial accounts. I told him about the divorce papers, the suddenness of it, and the strange timing that had left my mother reeling just as I emerged from the operating room. He was silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that usually precedes a life-altering revelation. He told me that he had been monitoring some unusual activity on their joint accounts for several months, but he had been hesitant to speak up without concrete proof. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful thudding that mirrored the sharp ache in my chest. He explained that a series of recurring wire transfers had been siphoning money from my father, his primary retirement account for exactly 3 years. Every single month, $4,000 vanished, moving through a complex web of shell companies and untraceable accounts before finally landing in a place that made my blood run cold. I sat up straighter, ignoring the searing pain of my healing incision, and gripped the hospital bed rails until my knuckles turned a ghostly white. This was not just a simple case of a failing marriage or a midlife crisis. This was a systematic draining of my father's life savings, executed with precision and a terrifying level of intimacy. I realized then that the divorce papers were not just a legal document meant to end a union. They were a frantic attempt to cover up a financial crime that had been growing in the shadows, while I was distracted by my own health battles. I felt a surge of cold, focused adrenaline replacing the fatigue, a sensation of clarity that I had not felt since my diagnosis. I was no longer the victim recovering from surgery. I was an investigator, and I was going to find out exactly who had been stealing from us. I ended the call with Mr. Henderson, my mind racing through a maze of possibilities and dark suspicions. The figures he mentioned, $4,000, every month for 36 months, added up to a staggering sum that could not simply vanish without someone noticing. My father was a meticulous man. A retired accountant who balanced his checkbook to the penny every Sunday evening. The fact that he hadn't flagged this was evidence of either extreme cognitive decline or a deep, orchestrated deception. I looked at the digital readout on the hospital monitor, the rhythmic beeping serving as a ticking clock in my mind. My sister Clara had always been the golden child, the one who lived 3 states away and constantly talked about her boutique, business, and her perfect suburban life. She was the one who insisted that I take Mom in, the one who made sure the narrative of our family tragedy was framed around my mother's sudden misfortune. My fingers hovered over the screen of my tablet, my pulse quickening as I pulled up my father's public tax filings. I knew enough about accounting from my own career to recognize the patterns of a hidden drain. I started cross-referencing dates, searching for any anomalies that occurred precisely when the money moved. My throat felt dry, and the sterile smell of the hospital began to suffocate me. I needed to get home, to my own computer, to my files, to the tools I needed to dismantle this illusion. I wasn't just fighting for my recovery anymore. I was fighting to expose the parasite that had attached itself to my family. The pain in my side was a dull roar now, but it didn't matter. The betrayal was far more agonizing than the surgery. I realized that my sister had positioned me to be the caretaker, the one who would be too busy with a sick mother to look at the bank records. She thought I was broken and distracted. She was wrong. I was just getting started. I managed to sign myself out of the hospital against the stern advice of my nursing staff, who warned me about the dangers of exertion so soon after such a massive procedure. I didn't care about the risks. Every minute I spent in that hospital was a minute. The culprit had to cover their tracks. My car felt like a sanctuary as I drove home, the familiar streets of my town blurring past, while my thoughts remained locked on the digital trail. I was about to hunt. I reached my house, a quiet, modest place that felt like a fortress against the encroaching chaos of my family. I moved slowly, favoring my right side, and sat down at my desk, with a singular focus that pushed the physical agony into the background. I bypassed my personal emails and opened the portal to my father's financial archives that Mr. Henderson had provided access to. The data sat before me like a puzzle, a chaotic mess of numbers that told a story of calculated, systematic theft. I began to map out the destination of the monthly $4,000 transfers. They were routed through a series of offshore holding companies, which was a standard tactic for people trying to hide assets, but the final destination was an LLC registered in Florida. I checked the registration details, my breath hitching as I realized that the registered agent for this LLC shared a name with a former neighbor of my sister's. It was a flimsy connection, the kind of thing that could easily be dismissed as a coincidence by a lazy investigator. But I knew my sister better than that. She was careful, she was intelligent, and she was arrogant. She had relied on the assumption that I would be too incapacitated by my cancer recovery to even look at the numbers. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across my study, I felt the first real spark of power returning to my limbs. I was not going to be the victim in this tragic story. I was the one holding the evidence, and I was going to use it to bring everything crashing down. I spent the entire night tracking the digital footprints, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitors as the moon climbed high and then began its slow descent. Every transfer was a calculated strike, timed with surgical precision to avoid triggering the automated fraud alerts on my father's bank accounts. I dug deeper into the metadata of the transactions, searching for any trace of the person who initiated the wires. My persistence finally yielded a breakthrough when I discovered an unsecured server log associated with the IP address of the Florida LLC. It was a digital breadcrumb, a tiny mistake made by someone who thought they were smarter than the system. The IP address mapped back to a router in a suburban neighborhood, my sister's neighborhood. My heart raced, not with fear, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. She hadn't just been involved. She had been the architect of this entire scheme, siphoning away my parents' security while they were distracted by their own fading health. I looked at the clock, realizing the sun would soon rise, and with it, the necessity of deciding how to handle this information. I felt a strange, detached calm wash over me. The surgery had removed a part of my body, but it had also removed my capacity for passive endurance. I realized that my sister had been banking on my silence, betting that I would be too preoccupied with the physical trauma of my mastectomy to question the status quo of our family. She had underestimated the steel that formed in my spine during those long hours in the operating room. I was no longer the fragile, sick daughter she expected me to be. I was the keeper of her secrets, and I held the power to destroy the comfortable life she had built on a foundation of stolen money and broken trust. The realization was both heavy and strangely exhilarating. I knew exactly what I had to do next to corner her in this game. The dawn brought a pale, unforgiving light into my room, highlighting the stacks of printed bank records scattered across my desk like confetti from a ruined party. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady as I pulled up the contact information for my sister, Clara. The urge to scream at her, to confront her immediately with the undeniable proof of her greed, was overwhelming, but I forced myself to remain patient. If I acted too quickly, she would destroy the digital evidence or find a way to manipulate the narrative to make me look unstable and paranoid. My transition from victim to strategist was almost complete. I needed one more piece of the puzzle to ensure that she could never escape the consequences of her actions. I decided to contact an old friend of mine who worked in cybersecurity, someone who didn't know my family or their history. I carefully scrubbed the documents of any identifying markers that could point back to me and sent them over with a cryptic message requesting an analysis of the origin point. The response came back within an hour, confirming what I had already suspected. The transfers originated from a home network that was specifically registered to her home address in the suburbs. It was the smoking gun. With this confirmation, the weight of the last 3 years began to lift from my shoulders, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus that I hadn't felt since before the diagnosis. My mother had been so proud of Clara, always boasting about her success and her seemingly perfect life, never suspecting that the wealth she flaunted was being built on the suffering of her own parents. I felt a surge of righteous fury, a fire that burned through the lingering physical pain of my surgery. I was ready to end this charade, not with tears or pleas for mercy, but with the cold, hard logic of the law. The pieces were finally falling into place, and the endgame was about to begin in earnest. I spent the morning crafting a trap, one that would force Clara into the open without her realizing that I held the upper hand. I drafted a message to her, adopting a tone of exhaustion and defeat, the kind of submissive language she expected from her ailing, vulnerable older sister. I told her that Mom could move in, but that Dad's accounts were such a mess after the divorce filing that we needed to consolidate everything into a single, temporary trust to protect the remaining assets from legal seizures. I watched the screen, waiting for the notification that she had read the message. My heartbeat slowed, becoming a steady, rhythmic thrum in my ears. I knew she was greedy, and I knew she believed that I was too weak to manage any significant financial maneuvering. If she bit, she would try to gain control of that trust, which would involve her signing documents that I had prepared with Mr. Henderson, documents that included a forensic audit clause. She would never notice until it was far too late. The silence in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating as I waited for her response. I imagined her reading my text, a smug smile spreading across her face as she pictured herself seizing control of the final remnants of our parents' estate. She thought she was the predator, but she didn't realize that she was merely walking into a cage I had constructed with precision. I looked at the surgical scars on my chest, a reminder of what she had ignored while she drained our father's accounts. That pain fueled my resolve. I was no longer interested in family reconciliation or saving face. I was interested in justice. As the notification finally pinged, a sense of grim satisfaction washed over me. She had taken the bait, and the final phase of her undoing was now officially underway. The reply from Clara arrived just moments later, dripping with the fake, sugary concern she always adopted when she wanted something. She agreed to the plan, saying it was a relief that I was taking the lead, completely unaware that she had just signed her own professional and financial death warrant. She suggested that we meet at my house the following afternoon to sign the papers, claiming she wanted to be there for me during my difficult recovery. I could almost hear the calculation in her words, the way she was already planning to maneuver me out of the picture. Once the funds were under her direct control, I typed back a simple affirming message, my fingers barely trembling as I set the final stage of the trap. I felt like a conductor leading a symphony of retribution, each movement planned to ensure the loudest possible conclusion. I spent the remainder of the day ensuring that every digital document, every forensic log, and every piece of financial correspondence was perfectly organized and ready to be handed over to the authorities. Mr. Henderson had promised to have a local investigator waiting nearby, someone who could handle the situation without making a scene that might alarm our neighbors. I was no longer just Andrea, the recovering cancer patient. I was a woman who had seen the darkest parts of her family and had decided that the only way to survive was to bring the truth to light. The house felt colder than it had before, but it was a clarity that I welcomed. I was ready to face her, not with the softness of a sister, but with the cold efficiency of a survivor who had lost everything and found something far more durable in the process. My recovery was just beginning. And for the first time in years, the future felt like something I could actually control. The plan was flawless, the trap was set, and all that remained was for the main actor to walk through the front door and face the consequences of her greed. The following afternoon arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to mirror the tension coiled tightly in my chest. I sat in my living room, the documents neatly stacked on the coffee table, watching the clock as the minutes ticked toward our scheduled meeting. I had arranged the room specifically, ensuring that the sunlight would hit the papers at an angle that made them impossible to read clearly from the doorway, forcing Clara to sit directly across from me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from the investigator, confirming his position in the parked vehicle just down the street. Everything was perfectly aligned. A sequence of events designed to expose years of betrayal in the span of a single conversation. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the phantom ache of my stitches, and reminded myself that this physical weakness was temporary. But the strength I had discovered during these last few days was mine to keep forever. When the sound of a car engine finally echoed in the driveway, I felt a strange surge of calm. The hunter had arrived at the kill site, unaware that the dynamic had shifted entirely. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, and walked slowly toward the front door. I could see her silhouette through the frosted glass, a portrait of rehearsed concern. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, greeting her with the same mask of fragility I had perfected over the phone. Clara breezed inside, her perfume cloying and sweet, already launching into a monologue about how difficult it was to handle the paperwork while I was so clearly unwell. I watched her eyes dart around the room, assessing the value of my belongings. Her predatory instincts clearly sharp and hungry. She had no idea that beneath my soft exterior, I was calculating exactly how to dismantle the entire life she had so carefully curated. The game had entered its final, most dangerous phase, and I was ready to win. Clara took a seat on the velvet sofa, her posture rigid with the fake sort of grace that always signaled she was performing for an audience, even when the room was empty. She didn't ask how I felt, nor did she glance at the surgical bandages still visible beneath my blouse. Instead, Her eyes were locked onto the thick manila envelope sitting on the coffee table. She spoke in hushed, practiced tones about the strain of our parents' divorce, spinning a web of sympathy that was designed to make me feel small, confused, and dependent on her guidance. I leaned back, resting my head against the cushions, and allowed her to continue her monologue. It was fascinating to watch her work, to see the way she twisted reality to suit her own selfish narrative. She claimed that she had been spending her own savings just to keep Mom afloat, a bold-faced lie that she delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned in her life. I nodded at appropriate intervals, letting her believe she was successfully manipulating me into signing away my rights. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of her deceit, and for a moment I felt a wave of nausea, not from my recovery, but from the realization of how deeply I had underestimated her capacity for cruelty. She was so convinced of her own brilliance, so absolutely certain that I was the broken, exhausted victim she wanted me to be, that she failed to notice the subtle shift in my gaze. I was no longer looking at my sister. I was looking at a thief who was about to be caught in the act. I watched her reach for the pen, her hand steady and eager, and I realized with a grim sense of triumph that she had no idea the trap was about to snap shut. My heart hammered, a drumbeat of anticipation for the moment when her world would finally, inevitably shatter into 1,000 pieces. She pushed the papers toward me, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light that she likely mistook for executive authority. I looked at the first page, the legal jargon designed to transfer power of attorney over the residual estate directly to her private account, and I felt a cold smile touch my lips. I didn't sign it. Instead, I stood up with a deliberate, slow movement, my body feeling more grounded than it had in months. I walked over to the bookshelf and retrieved a thin, blue folder I had hidden behind a row of worn classics. I tossed it onto the coffee table right on top of her fraudulent contract. Her smile faltered, replaced by a momentary flash of confusion that quickly morphed into genuine alarm. I didn't say a word. I simply gestured for her to open it. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the printouts, the bank statements, the IP address logs, and the notarized affidavit from the forensic investigator connecting the dots directly to her router. The color drained from her face, leaving her features looking stark and hollow under the afternoon sun. She tried to stammer out a protest, a desperate attempt to frame the documents as a malicious forgery, but her voice failed her. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy curtain falling over the stage of her manufactured reality. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years, and I saw the recognition of her own destruction reflected in her wide, panicked eyes. She realized then that my surgery had not been a weakness. It had been the catalyst for her own undoing. I leaned in close, my voice steady, calm, and utterly devoid of the warmth she expected, and I told her that her time as the puppeteer was finished. The game was over, and the consequences of her choices were about to become the only reality she would know for the next several decades. The finality of my words seemed to hang in the air like a physical weight, pressing down on Clara until she slumped against the sofa, the life draining out of her carefully crafted facade. She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of heavy footsteps on my porch shattered her resolve. The investigator and 2 uniformed officers stepped into the frame, their presence rendering any further deceit utterly futile. I stood tall, my physical pain fading into the background, replaced by the profound, icy satisfaction of absolute justice finally served. As they read her the rights she had so brazenly violated for others, I felt the last lingering ghost of my former timid self dissolve, leaving behind a woman forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by the sharp, undeniable truth of survival. This wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about reclaiming the agency that had been stolen from me while I was fighting for my very life in that cold hospital room. I watched them escort her away, the slamming of the cruiser door echoing, like a gavel signaling the end of her reign over our broken family. I finally walked to the window, watching the tail lights fade into the gathering dark, feeling a strange, quiet peace settle over the house. The storm had passed, the wreckage had been cleared, and for the first time in a long time, the path ahead was entirely my own to walk. My journey from the silence of a victim to the roaring voice of my own. Truth has only just begun, and the world is about to see exactly what I am capable of when I have nothing left to lose but my own resilience. If you have ever felt the sting of betrayal or found the strength to stand against those who underestimated your spirit, join me as I rebuild my life from the ashes of this tragedy. Like and subscribe to follow my journey as I share the brutal truth about how I transformed my pain into ultimate justice and reclaimed my future. You won't want to miss what happens next.